My stepbrother told my wife that I cheated on her to take her away, but I took revenge on him. This situation started years ago when I was a kid. My parents got divorced when I was 8. It was a bad time with a lot of arguing and noise. My mom was alone for a while after that, working to keep things together. Then she met Dave, who became my stepdad. Dave was okay, but he had a son named Jake, my stepbrother. Jake was 2 years older than me. From the first day we met, we didn't get along. He acted like he was more important than everyone else. Dave gave him everything he wanted. If Jake asked for a toy, he got it. If he got upset, Dave let him have his way. I didn't have much back then. After the divorce, I slept in a room with my mom's sewing machine because we couldn't afford more space. When we were kids, Jake was jealous of me over small things. I got a B on a test, and he was mad because he got a C. I made a friend, and he tried to take that friend for himself. It happened all the time. He stared at me during dinner like I did something wrong. Dave didn't notice. He told me to be nice to Jake, as if I was the one causing trouble. My mom wanted everyone to get along, but she worked too much to see what was happening. By the time we were teenagers, I stopped paying attention to him. He talked about things he didn't own or made up stories to sound impressive. I nodded and kept going. It wasn't worth arguing. Now I'm 29. I've been married to my wife, Sarah, for 3 years. She's great. We met at a friend's barbecue, started talking, and got together. After 3 years, I still feel lucky to have her. Jake hasn't changed. He's 31, lives in Dave's basement, and can't find a woman who likes him. Whenever we see him, he complains about it. He says I'm lucky to have Sarah or that he can't find anyone who understands him. I don't say much back. Sarah thinks it's funny and doesn't mind. But recently, Jake's comments about her changed. They got more specific and strange. That's when this whole problem began. Things started getting worse about 6 months ago. Jake was around more often because Dave and my mom invited us all over for family dinners. I didn't love going, but Sarah said it was good to keep the peace, so we showed up. Jake would sit there, picking at his food, and then he'd start talking about Sarah. He'd say things like how pretty she was or how she was too good for a guy like me. At first, it was just annoying. Sarah brushed it off, and I didn't take it seriously. He'd done this kind of thing before, talking me down to make himself look better. But then he started bringing up my past. He'd mention girls I knew in high school, like old crushes or exes from when I was 15. It was random and out of nowhere. He'd laugh and act like it was a funny story, but it felt off. Sarah didn't seem bothered by it. She'd smile and change the subject, which I appreciated. I figured Jake was just being his usual self, jealous and desperate for attention. He'd never had a steady girlfriend, and it ate at him. Every time we saw him, he'd complain about how women didn't give him a chance. Then he'd look at Sarah and say he'd do anything to find someone like her. It was uncomfortable, but I didn't call him out. I didn't want to start a fight at Dave's house. My mom already had enough stress, and I wasn't about to add to it. So I let it slide, even when Jake's comments got bolder. The tipping point came last month. I'd been working late shifts at my job, nothing crazy, just warehouse stuff to cover some extra bills. Sarah was home most evenings, and Jake knew that. He started texting her more, asking how she was or saying he was bored. She told me about it, and I didn't think much of it at first. He's family, sort of, so I figured he was just lonely. But then one night, I got home from work around 9 p.m. The house was quiet, which was unusual. Sarah's usually up watching TV or reading. I walked into the living room, and she was sitting on the couch, crying. Her face was red, and she wouldn't look at me. That's when I knew something was seriously wrong. I asked Sarah what happened. She didn't answer at first, just kept staring at the floor, wiping her eyes. I sat down next to her, but she pulled away. That stung. Finally, she said Jake had come over earlier that day. She let him in because he said he needed to talk about something important. I didn't even know he'd been there. I'd been at work since morning. Sarah told me Jake showed her his phone. On it were screenshots of emails. They were supposed to be from me, sent to some woman I didn't know. The messages were flirty, talking about meeting up and how I was tired of being married. Sarah said she read them and felt sick. Jake told her he found them by accident, and thought she deserved to know the truth. I was stunned. I've never cheated on Sarah, not once. I don't even know who this woman was supposed to be. I told Sarah that, but she shook her head. She said the emails had details that sounded like me, stuff about my job, my schedule. It looked real to her. I kept saying they were fake, that I'd never do that, but she wasn't listening. She got up, went to our bedroom, and shut the door. I stood there in the living room, trying to process it. Jake had done this. He'd made up a lie and fed it to my wife. I grabbed my phone and called him right then. He picked up after a few rings, sounding casual, like nothing was wrong. I asked him why he showed Sarah those emails. He acted confused, saying he didn't know what I meant. I yelled at him to stop lying, but he just hung up. After that call, I went to check on Sarah. She was packing a bag. She said she couldn't stay with me, not after what she'd seen. I begged her to hear me out, but she wouldn't. She said she needed space and was going to her sister's place. I watched her leave, and it felt like my whole world was falling apart. Jake had crossed a line I didn't think he'd ever cross. He wasn't just jealous anymore, he was trying to ruin my life. And the worst part? It was working. The next few days were rough. Sarah wouldn't answer my calls or texts. I left voicemails explaining that the emails were fake, that Jake set me up, but I had no proof. She was gone, staying at her sister's house, and I was alone in our place. It was quiet, too quiet. I couldn't sleep, couldn't eat much. I kept replaying what happened, trying to figure out how Jake pulled this off. He must have made those emails himself, added details he knew about me to make them convincing. He'd been around us enough to pick up on my routines, my late shifts, the warehouse job, all of it. The guy's a creep, but I didn't realize he was this calculated. Meanwhile, I heard from my mom that Jake was acting normal at home. She called to check on me because Sarah's sister had told her we were having problems. I didn't tell her everything, just said we had a fight. I didn't want her involved yet. But she mentioned Jake had been out a lot lately, saying he was helping a friend. I knew what that meant. He was probably trying to see Sarah. I called her sister to ask if Jake had been by. She said yeah, he showed up the day after Sarah moved in, bringing coffee and acting concerned. Sarah didn't let him stay long, but he kept texting her after. That made my blood boil. He wasn't just trying to break us up, he was making a move on her. I couldn't let it go. I had to do something. Sitting around feeling sorry for myself wasn't fixing anything. Jake thought he'd won, that he'd wrecked my marriage and could swoop in. I wasn't going to let him get away with it. I started thinking about how to catch him. He'd lied to Sarah, made up evidence, and played innocent when I called him. If I could get him to admit it, maybe I could show her the truth. I dug through my old stuff and found a little voice recorder I'd used for work notes. It still worked. I decided to confront him, record it, and make him confess. It was risky, but I didn't care, I needed my wife back. I waited until the weekend to go to Jake's place. He still lived in Dave's basement, so I knew where to find him. I didn't tell anyone I was going, just grabbed the recorder, stuck it in my pocket, and drove over. It was Saturday afternoon, and Dave's car wasn't in the driveway. Good. I didn't want him there for this. I knocked on the basement door, the one Jake used as his entrance. He opened it after a minute, looking surprised to see me. He was in a t-shirt and sweatpants, hair messy like he'd just woken up. I didn't waste time. I stepped inside and started talking loud, asking why he lied to Sarah about those emails. Jake tried to play dumb again. He said he didn't know what I was talking about, that I needed to calm down. That just made me angrier. I got in his face, telling him I knew he made it all up, that he'd been jealous of me forever and this was his pathetic way of getting back at me. He backed up, looking nervous. I kept pushing, saying he ruined my marriage over some twisted crush on my wife. That's when he snapped. He yelled that yeah, he made the emails, and so what? He said Sarah was too good for me, that he'd wanted her for years and I didn't deserve her. He admitted he'd hoped she'd leave me and give him a shot. I stayed calm after that, even though I wanted to punch him. I pulled the recorder out of my pocket and held it up. His face went white. I told him I got every word he just said, and he was going to confess to Sarah or I'd play it for everyone, Dave, my mom, her sister, all of them. He stared at me, breathing hard, then slumped onto his couch. He didn't say anything for a minute. I told him to get his phone and call her right then. He hesitated, but I didn't back down. I said if he didn't, I'd make sure everyone knew what a liar he was. Finally, he grabbed his phone and dialed her number. Jake put the phone on speaker so I could hear. Sarah picked up after a few rings. Her voice sounded tired, like she hadn't been sleeping either. Jake stumbled over his words at first, saying he needed to tell her something. I stood there, arms crossed, watching him. He admitted the emails were fake. He said he made them up because he was jealous of me and wanted to mess things up between us. He told her he'd always liked her and thought if she left me, he might have a chance. His voice cracked a little, but I didn't feel sorry for him. Sarah didn't say much, just asked if it was true, and he said yes. Then she hung up without another word. I took the recorder back and told Jake he was done. I said if he ever came near Sarah or me again, I'd make sure Dave and my mom heard everything. He didn't argue, just sat there, staring at the floor. I left after that, feeling a mix of relief and anger. I'd caught him, but it didn't fix the damage yet. When I got home, I played the recording again to make sure it was clear. It was. Every word he said came through. I sent it to Sarah with a text saying I was sorry she had to deal with this, and that I'd never cheated. I told her I'd wait if she needed time, but I wanted her to come home. Hours passed with no reply. I didn't push her. I knew she had to process it. That night I sat on the couch, staring at my phone. Around 10 p.m., I heard a car pull into the driveway. I looked out the window and saw Sarah getting out, carrying her bag. My chest tightened. She walked up to the door, and I let her in. She didn't say anything at first, just set her stuff down and sat next to me. Then she said she'd listened to the recording and believed me. She was sorry for doubting me, but Jake had her convinced. I told her it wasn't her fault. We didn't talk much more that night, just sat there, glad to be in the same room again. The next morning, Sarah and I talked more. She said she'd been a wreck at her sister's place, torn up about those emails. She didn't want to believe I'd cheat, but Jake had made it sound so real. She told me he'd kept texting her after she left, saying he was worried about her and offering to help. It creeped her out, especially when he showed up with coffee that one time. She said she started to suspect something was off, but she didn't know what to do until the recording. Hearing Jake admit it cleared everything up for her. She was mad at him, not me, and wanted to put it behind us. I told her about confronting Jake, how he broke down and confessed. She shook her head, saying she never thought he'd go that far. I agreed. I'd known he was jealous since we were kids, but this was next level messed up. We decided to cut him out completely. No more family dinners if he was there, no more pretending everything was fine. Sarah said she'd block his number, and I planned to do the same. We didn't need that kind of toxicity around us. I felt lighter after that, like we'd taken control back. Later that day, I called my mom. I didn't want to drag her into it, but she deserved to know why we wouldn't be around Jake anymore. I kept it short, told her he'd lied to Sarah about me cheating and tried to split us up. She was quiet for a while, then said she was sorry. She'd seen how Jake acted growing up but thought he'd get over it. I said he hadn't, and we were done with him. She understood, though I could tell it hurt her. Dave would probably take Jake's side. He always did, but I didn't care. My focus was on me and Sarah, not fixing their family drama. By the end of the call, I felt like I'd closed the chapter I'd been stuck in too long. Things started settling down after that. Sarah and I spent the next week just getting back to normal. She unpacked her bag, and we cooked dinner together like we used to. It wasn't perfect right away. There was still some tension from everything that happened, but it got better each day. I noticed she'd check in with me more, like asking how my shift went or if I'd be home late. I did the same, making sure she felt okay. We didn't talk about Jake much. It was like an unspoken agreement to leave him in the past. The recording stayed on my phone, though, just in case he tried anything again. Word got around the family pretty fast. My mom must have told Dave, because he called me a few days later. He sounded annoyed, saying I'd overreacted and Jake was just mixed up. He said I should have talked to him first instead of going after his son. I told him Jake faked emails to ruin my marriage and went after my wife. Dave didn't have much to say after that, just mumbled something about families sticking together and hung up. I figured he'd defend Jake no matter what. That was fine. I didn't need his approval. Sarah's sister called too, apologizing for not seeing through Jake sooner. She'd thought he was just being friendly when he showed up. I said it was okay, she couldn't have known. Jake didn't reach out. No texts, no calls, nothing. I checked his social media once, out of curiosity. He posted some vague status about people betraying him, but that was it. I blocked him after that. Sarah did too. We heard from my mom that he was sulking at home, barely leaving the basement. Dave tried to get him out, but he wouldn't budge. I didn't feel bad. He dug his own hole. For the first time in years, I didn't have to deal with his jealousy or his games. It was quiet, and I liked it that way. Sarah and I were stronger for it, too. We'd been through hell and come out the other side. It's been a month since all this went down, and life's finally stable again. Sarah and I are back to where we were before Jake's stunt, maybe even better. We've been talking more, Not just about what happened but about everything. She said it made her realize how much she didn't want to lose me, and I feel the same. We're planning a weekend trip soon, just the two of us, to get away from all the family noise. Work's been steady too. I'm still pulling late shifts, but it's easier now that I'm not stressing about home. The warehouse isn't glamorous, but it pays the bills, and that's enough for me. Jake's out of the picture completely. My mom says he's still holed up in Dave's basement, not doing much. Dave tried to smooth things over once, inviting us to dinner, but I said no. I told him we're not coming around if Jake's there. He didn't push it after that. My mom visits us instead now, which works better. She doesn't bring him up unless I ask, and I don't. I don't care what he's doing, whether he's sulking or pretending it never happened. He crossed a line he can't uncross, and I'm not wasting energy on him anymore. Sarah feels the same. She deleted his number, and hasn't heard a peep since the confession. Looking back, I can't believe it got this bad. Jake's been jealous since we were kids, but I never thought he'd try to tank my marriage over it. Getting that recording was the best move I made, it saved us. I keep it on my phone, not because I need it now, but as a reminder that I fought for what mattered. Sarah and I are solid, and that's what counts. Jake can stew in his basement forever for all I care. I've got my life back, and he's not taking it again. Revenge wasn't about hurting him. It was about proving the truth and keeping what's mine. And it